Hi, I'm Steve Archer, and I'm sitting in Witton Park Academy, which is a high school in Blackburn in Lancashire, at 4:30 at the end of a long and interesting day. Please excuse me if there's no presentation behind me, no screens for you to look at, no slides for you to read while I'm wittering away. But I always kind of think it's best to do things authentically at the end of the day. I'd like to, I suppose, give you a little bit of background. I was in industry for 20 years before I ever came into teaching, and I'm now in teaching for 16 years, I think. And most of that time I spent with, although I've taught history and various other subjects in class, I've always been on the pastoral side, particularly dealing with young people and their behaviours in school. And around about 7 years ago, I got involved with a bit of a movement, it felt at the time, to investigate the role of things like adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, in education, because similar work was going on in the health service, and it was happening with the police services in different parts of the country. And there was a need, I suppose, to look into the earliest interventions. So I'm in the UK in what's called a secondary school. The young people here are 11 to 16, by which time a lot of them have had a story which continues during the 5 years that they're with me. And we've had to, if you like, adapt as we've taken, I suppose, steps on the journey from ACE awareness through to being what I hope is a more trauma-informed environment. I think there's a large number of staff that have been on the same journey as me over the years. And that the way that we now respond to young people, communicate with outside agencies, including the police, local authorities, hopefully we're on a journey where these things improve to the point where we can not only serve our communities better, but equally that we can prevent some of the harm that happens to young people occurring in the first place. Now, I've got two main kind of things that I'd want to say today, and if you'll bear with me while I kind of explain them to you. The first thing is that, in my experience, education is the world of education, schools particularly, are very, very traditional, where in many ways a mindset that is recognisable to people of my age. I'm in my 50s. There are some aspects of education now, particularly attitudes towards behaviour, the use of sanctions, that I recognise from back in the day. And to be honest, I don't suppose that some of them have changed apart from the physical chastisement. I don't suppose many of them have changed if I was to go back 100 years. The use of detention, the way that often schools wield an incredible authority over the lives of young people and the families that they come from. A school has the power to send somebody away, to exclude them, or in my old-fashioned money, expel them, as it was said in my day. This is, for some, particularly for parents that have had their own, perhaps, negative experiences of education. I often say to colleagues that, a teacher phoning at the end of the phone may as well be a police officer, because we have considerable authority over these people's lives. We can make decisions which absolutely turn their world upside down. We have the power to remove the young person from education, to send them somewhere else. And I don't think sometimes that in education we realise fully, or we don't fully appreciate quite how dramatic an effect we can have on people's lives. There is therefore, I think, a responsibility on us to understand the story and the community from the young people coming from that we teach, serve. And part of that is understanding how their circumstances outside of education impact on their behaviours. And I don't suppose there's anybody here that would disagree with me that this new thinking could have profound impacts on the long-term health, the societal interactions, cohesion that we experience outside of our workplaces in our domestic lives. There are huge positives, I believe, if we can adopt a more joined-up approach in what I call in this country the public sector. You know, that schools, social workers, the National Health Service and police share information perhaps more readily, communicate better, so that when there are those transitions as people move from one stage of their education to another and then beyond into the adult world, that actually if we have been working with somebody over a number of years, that we would actually continue to work with them, or at least be aware of their circumstances, so that should they reach a crisis point, we're able to help them in the most efficacious way. It does feel sometimes, again, those traditional models where we perhaps are the only people we still coerce into behaviour are young people. We certainly wouldn't have this we wouldn't expect veterans in the military or people that work in the emergency services to be treated in such a, sometimes it seems to me, disdainful way. The second thing I kind of want to go on to really is that ACEs, there's an awful lot of attention around ACEs, and I'm quite well versed in the criticism in various professional areas about the over-reliance on ACEs. And I think for education, ACEs is just part of a picture of a whole, if you like. And I am always concerned that where we can identify risk, then we also, if you like, narrow our vision about those people that we'll help and intervene with. It's taken a long while, I think, for people to realise that sometimes having knowledge and a convenient kind of knowledge in some ways, like ACEs, that we can't then use that as a peg to hang every type of behaviour and explain everybody's kind of life circumstances. There are, for me, a number of occasions where what would be to some people relatively minor things have had a dramatic and almost disastrous effect on somebody's life. On the other hand, there are people that, with great resilience and with very strong buffering networks around them, have been able to overcome numerous adverse experiences. ACEs does lend itself in some respects to being given a score, for people to have a number. And I do think that, particularly in education, there has to be great care taken with justice services, with the police services, that we don't just ascribe a number and a risk, that actually we look at the individual circumstances. And I suppose that brings me in some respects to my final point. The idea that there is a one-size-fits-all punitive system, that we can have zero tolerance approaches to particular incidences in school. So it seems, sadly, increasingly, that particularly after the lockdowns and coronaviruses, and that young people and their access to things like narcotics is increasing. It's more commonly available, it seems to me, to a lot of young people in the areas that I work in. There are many schools that would have a zero tolerance approach to that. If we don't acknowledge the fact that some of these young people might be at risk of criminal exploitation, that by excluding them from schools, by sending them out away from our care, that we actually potentially send them into more harm and, if you like, bolster the networks of criminals that are using our young people to distribute their product. At the same time, I would suggest there's a similar approach to things like knife crime. Again, in school, it's almost taboo, the idea that a young person will be carrying a blade must be, for the safety of everybody else, sent away from us. And of course, there could be many reasons why that young person is carrying a blade. If we don't look into the individual circumstances of these things, we may be making a grave error and putting a young person in grave danger. I think there's some radical thinking needs to happen in schools about what facilities we actually offer, and whether we truly can offer a wraparound care and communication with different agencies so that a person can be supported in adversity through the different stages of their young life. I do feel a responsibility as a teacher to prepare young people for the outside world. At the same time, I also feel a responsibility to make sure that they're not a burden as they leave from our care. And I do think that increased, I suppose my main wish for all of this would be that where information is shared effectively, there can also be very effective interventions. And schools, with social services, with family support, with the National Health Service, with the police forces, I do think we can make effective partners. I do think sometimes, though, there is a reticence for us to share information, and we can think of very many different reasons not to, from confidentiality to kind of unprofessional pride in our own area, that kind of silo thinking, we're the only ones that know how to do it. But I do think that perhaps even if now things are individually led, hopefully collectively, people will open their eyes to the idea that we're part of one life journey for a lot of these young people. And seeing as we all touch their life at some point, then really we should all be working together to make their situation better. Schools are a really interesting place, and I'm glad that I've ended up in them. And I do feel that the work that we've done around trauma, adverse childhood experiences, is perhaps the most valuable stuff that I've done. But it needs to go further, and we need to improve the universal conversation, speak the same language, so that actually we can communicate effectively to help reduce, if you like, the number of people getting into crisis situations. Thank you for listening. I hope it makes sense. It might come across as a stream of consciousness, but I've just come off an interesting day. So they're my thoughts. Thank you.